The rag in Anna's hand moved in slow, hypnotic circles, chasing the ghost of a coffee ring across the laminate countertop. It was 4 o'clock on a Tuesday, which in the economy of the greasy spoon meant it was yesterday. The lunch rush was a memory, the dinner shift a distant threat, and the time in between belonged to the quiet hum of the coolers and the rhythmic ticking of the big, grease-filmed clock. Rain slicked the windows, turning the world outside into a watercolor of blurred headlights and hurried umbrellas. Each time the bell above the door chimed, it was a small violence against the quiet. Anna didn't look up. It would be Gary from the hardware store, wanting to complain about his wife, or Mrs. Gable, wanting to complain about her hip. The bell chimed. The sound was different this time, softer, accompanied by a gust of cold, wet air that smelled of asphalt and damp wool. Anna finished her circle on the counter and finally lifted her head. In the doorway stood a woman, small and hunched, a black scarf tied tightly over her hair. She wasn't a regular. She was a ghost who had drifted in from the storm, her dark coat dripping a puddle onto the worn linoleum. Her face was a roadmap of a life lived elsewhere, her skin pale and translucent over fine bones, her eyes dark and deep-set. She clutched a worn leather handbag to her chest like a shield. She didn't move further into the room, just stood there, dripping and uncertain, as if she had taken a wrong turn 1,000 miles ago and had only just realized it. Anna felt a familiar, unwelcome tug. Her boss, Mel, would have already been walking towards the woman, a tight, practiced smile on his face, ready to explain that they were between services. Mel believed in rules. Anna believed in what was right in front of her. And right in front of her was a woman who looked like she hadn't been warm in a very long time. Anna put the rag down. She untied her apron, the knot familiar under her fingers, and hung it on its hook. Technically, she was off the clock. Technically, the grills were cold. She walked towards the woman, her worn sneakers silent on the floor. The woman's eyes, when they met Anna's, were not pleading. They were simply exhausted. "It's raining pretty hard," Anna said, her voice gentle. The woman just blinked, a droplet of water catching in the fine wrinkles at the corner of her eye. She didn't seem to understand the words, only the tone. Anna gestured to a booth in the corner, the red vinyl cracked but clean.
"Here, sit down."
"Get out of the rain for a minute." The woman hesitated, her gaze flickering from Anna's face to the empty diner, as if expecting a trap. Anna gave a small, encouraging nod. Slowly, the old woman shuffled to the booth and slid in, her movements stiff. She kept her bag on her lap, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle. Anna watched her for a moment, the way her shoulders were drawn up to her ears, a posture of perpetual defense. She looked less like a person than a small, fragile bird that had forgotten how to fly. Anna went behind the counter. The soup of the day was tomato bisque. There was still half a pot left on the warmer. It was Mel's rule to throw it out at 3, but Anna always waited until she was locking up. "Waste not, want not," her own grandmother used to say. She ladled the thick, orange-red soup into a heavy ceramic bowl. The smell was rich and warm, a cloud of basil and cream. She grabbed a packet of saltines and sliced a heel of yesterday's rye, putting it on a plate with 2 pats of butter. She carried it all over to the booth and set it down on the table. The woman stared at the food, then up at Anna. There was a profound, unnerving stillness in her gaze. She said something, a soft cascade of Italian, the words smooth and musical. Anna just shook her head with a small smile. "I don't understand, but please, eat." She pushed the bowl a little closer. The woman's hand, trembling slightly, reached for the spoon. The silence in the diner was no longer empty. It was filled with the small, specific sounds of the woman eating. The soft clink of the spoon against the bowl, the quiet slurp, the crinkle of the cracker wrapper. Anna went back to her work, wiping down the other tables, refilling the salt and pepper shakers. She didn't stare, but she was aware of the woman in the corner with a kind of peripheral intensity. She could feel the focus, the single-minded purpose with which she ate the soup. It wasn't the distracted picking of a person with other options. It was the deliberate consumption of someone for whom this meal was the most important thing in the world. When the spoon finally scraped the bottom of the bowl, The sound was loud in the quiet room. Anna turned. The woman was carefully wiping her mouth with a paper napkin. She had eaten everything. The soup, the crackers, the bread. The butter was gone. She looked different. The tension in her shoulders had eased, and a faint touch of color had returned to her cheeks. She was still an old, tired woman in a wet coat, but she was no longer a ghost. She was solid. She was here. The woman looked at Anna, and this time, her eyes were clear. She spoke again, another tumble of Italian, but this time she pointed at her own chest, then at the empty bowl, and then she made a gesture with her hands, a small, blooming motion. Anna understood. It was good. Thank you. Anna just nodded, a warmth spreading through her own chest that had nothing to do with the diner's heating. The woman fumbled with the clasp on her handbag, her old fingers struggling. Anna walked over.
No, no.
It's okay. It's on the house. The woman paused, her brow furrowed in confusion. Anna pointed to herself, then made a gesture of giving, pushing her hands forward. My treat. Understanding dawned on the woman's face, followed by something else. A flicker of pride, maybe, or dignity. She shook her head firmly and finally managed to open the bag. She pulled out a small, worn coin purse. Anna put a gentle hand on the woman's arm. Please, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It was just soup. The woman looked at Anna's hand on her arm, then back at her face. For a long moment, they stayed like that. Then, the old woman gave a slow, deep nod. She closed her purse and put it away. She gathered herself, her movements still stiff, but now imbued with a quiet grace. As she stood and slid out of the booth, her handbag snagged on the edge of the table and tipped, spilling a small, white object onto the seat. A handkerchief, folded into a neat square, exquisitely embroidered with a single, dark blue. Neither of them noticed. The woman simply straightened her coat, gave Anna one last, long look, a look that held a strange and solemn weight, and walked out into the rain. The bell chimed her departure, and the diner was quiet again. The next day, the rain had been replaced by a thin, watery sunlight that did little to warm the air. The lunch rush came and went, a predictable flurry of burgers and fries and Mel's booming voice telling jokes that weren't funny. Anna moved through it all with practiced ease, her mind a Rolodex of orders and table numbers. It was in the lull, that same 4 o'clock quiet, that the black car pulled up to the curb. It wasn't a car, really.
It was a statement.
A long, gleaming obsidian sedan so out of place in front of the greasy spoon it felt like a glitch in the universe. It had no visible mud, no dents, no faded paint. It just sat there, humming with a low, expensive power. The driver's side door opened, but no one got out. Instead, the rear door opened, and a man emerged. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit that probably cost more than Anna made in 6 months. His hair was black, cut short, his jaw sharp. He moved with a kind of predatory stillness, his eyes scanning the street before they settled on the diner's front window. He wasn't looking at the diner. He was assessing it. For a moment, he just stood there, a figure of sharp angles and dark wool against the cheerful, faded red of the diner's facade. Then he opened the door again and leaned inside, helping someone out. A small boy, no older than 6 or 7, with the same dark hair and a serious, unsmiling face. The man took the boy's hand, and they walked towards the door.
The bell chimed.
Every head in the diner, all 3 of them, turned. Mel, who had been tallying receipts, looked up, his pen frozen in midair. Gary from the hardware store stopped his story mid-sentence. The man's presence sucked the air out of the room. He paused in the doorway, his gaze sweeping over the interior. His eyes were dark, and they missed nothing. They landed on Anna. I am looking for someone, he said. His voice was low, with a heavy accent, each word chosen and placed with deliberation. It wasn't a question. It was a declaration of intent. Yesterday, an old woman, my mother, Anna's heart gave a small, hard thump against her ribs. She wiped her hands on her apron, the gesture automatic. She was here, Anna said, her voice even. She came in to get out of the rain. The man's gaze sharpened. He took a step further into the diner, the small boy a silent shadow at his side. The boy's eyes were what held Anna. They were old eyes in a young face, wide and dark and full of a quiet, watchful intelligence. He wasn't looking at the diner. He was looking at Anna. "She is unwell," the man said, the word tasting strange in his mouth. "She wanders. She forgets." He was not apologizing for his mother. He was stating a fact of his world. "You are kind to her again, not a question." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a wallet. It was thin, black leather. He extracted a thick fold of cash, hundreds, Anna saw with a jolt, and placed it on the counter. The gesture was clean, impersonal. A transaction.
"For your trouble," he said.
The money lay there, a stark, impossible rectangle on the worn laminate. It was more than her rent, for 3 months. It was a solution to so many problems. It was an insult. Anna looked from the money to the man's face. His expression was unreadable, a mask of polite control. But underneath it, she sensed a deep, weary impatience. This was how his world worked. Problems were identified, and money was applied until they went away. "It was just soup," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She pushed the money back across the counter towards him. "I don't want your money." A flicker of something, surprise? Annoyance? Crossed his face. It was gone as quickly as it came. "You fed her. You gave her shelter. This has a value." "Not everything does," Anna replied, holding his gaze. The silence stretched. It was a standoff, a quiet battle of two entirely different currencies. Mel was watching from the end of the counter, his eyes wide. The boy, Matteo, had not moved. He was still watching Anna, his small face solemn. It was the boy who broke the spell. He let go of his father's hand and took a single step forward, pointing a small finger at the booth in the corner. "Nana," he said. The word was soft, a perfect, clear note in the tense air. The man, Marco, looked at his son, and for the briefest of moments, the mask slipped. A deep, profound grief washed over his features, so raw and unguarded it was like looking into an open wound. Then it was gone. He looked back at Anna, and in that moment, she remembered. The handkerchief. She had found it when she'd wiped down the booth last night, a small square of impossible softness. She'd tucked it into her apron pocket, meaning to wash it.
She pulled it out now.
It was still neatly folded. "She left this," Anna said, holding it out. Marco stared at the handkerchief. He didn't take it immediately. He looked at the embroidered Elena, and his jaw tightened. He reached out and took it from her, his fingers brushing hers. His skin was cool. He closed his hand around the small piece of fabric, his knuckles showing white. He didn't look at the money again. He just gave Anna a single, sharp nod, took his son's hand, and walked out.
The bell chimed.
The black car pulled silently away from the curb and disappeared. The money was still on the counter. They came back 3 days later. It was a Saturday morning, the diner humming with the weekend breakfast crowd. Families with sticky-fingered children, couples reading the paper, hungover college students ordering stacks of pancakes. When the bell chimed and Marco, his mother Elena, and the boy Matteo walked in, a hush fell over the room. It was as if a scene from a foreign film had been spliced into the middle of a familiar sitcom. Elena looked better today. She wore a simple dress and a clean cardigan, her white hair neatly combed. She seemed smaller, more fragile in the daylight, but the lost, haunted look was gone from her eyes. She saw Anna and her face broke into a slow, genuine smile. Marco, in a dark sweater and trousers, looked just as out of place as he had in the suit. He held the door for his mother, his hand resting lightly on her back, guiding her to the same corner booth.
It was occupied.
A family of 4 looked up, startled, as the formidable man and his small entourage stopped beside their table. Marco didn't say a word. He just stood there, his presence a silent, overwhelming request. The father of the family, a large man in a polo shirt, took one look at Marco's face, stammered something about being finished anyway, and quickly began gathering his children. Anna watched, her stomach tightening, as the family practically fled, leaving a half-eaten plate of waffles behind. Marco slid into the booth opposite his mother and son, his back to the wall. He was positioning himself, Anna realized. Facing the room. Facing the door. It was instinctual. Anna picked up a menu and a damp cloth and walked over. "Morning," she said, her voice deliberately cheerful as she wiped away the syrup rings the previous family had left. "Coffee." Marco nodded, his eyes scanning the room before returning to her. "For me. And an orange juice for my son," he looked at his mother. "Nana?" he asked, his voice softer than Anna had yet heard it. Elena looked at the menu, though she couldn't read it. She then looked at Anna and said one of the few English words she seemed to know. "Soup?" Anna smiled. "We have split pea today. Or I can warm up some tomato from yesterday." Elena's eyes lit up. Tomato, while Anna got their drinks. She felt the eyes of the entire diner on her. Whispers followed her to the coffee machine. She poured the coffee, the juice, and then went to the warmer to ladle out the tomato bisque. She was acutely aware of the performance of it all. The act of serving them was a public declaration of something. She wasn't sure what. She just knew it felt important. When she brought the food, Matteo was drawing on a napkin with a crayon he'd produced from his pocket. He was focused, his tongue sticking out slightly from the corner of his mouth. As Anna set down his juice, he looked up at her and pushed the napkin across the table. On it was a drawing. A stick figure with a yellow circle for a head and a triangle for a dress. Anna. She was holding a red bowl. Next to her was another stick figure, smaller and bent over, with a black scarf on her head. Above them, blue lines represented rain. It was the entire story, told in crayon on a paper napkin. Anna stared at it, a lump forming in her throat. She looked at Matteo, whose serious eyes were waiting for her reaction. "It's beautiful," she whispered. She picked it up carefully and folded it, tucking it into her apron pocket, next to where the handkerchief had been. The visits became a strange new fixture in the diner's rhythm. They never came during the chaos of the lunch rush. They always came in the afternoon, in the quiet hours. Sometimes it was just Marco and Matteo. Sometimes Elena came with them. They always sat in the same booth. Marco would drink black coffee, his gaze distant, as if listening to a conversation in another room. Elena would have her soup. Matteo, after the first few visits, graduated from orange juice to a small plate of pancakes, which he would eat with a surgeon's precision, one small, perfect square at a time. Anna learned the landscape of their silences. She learned that Marco's silence was a fortress, but one with cracks. She saw it in the way his hand would sometimes pause, his coffee cup halfway to his lips, his eyes fixed on the rain streaming down the window. One such afternoon, the diner was empty except for them. The sound of the rain was a steady drumming on the roof. She liked the rain, Marco said, not to Anna but to the window, to the middle distance. The sentence hung in the air between them, heavy and fragile. Anna was refilling the sugar dispenser. She didn't stop. She just continued her small, methodical task, giving him the space to hold the thought. "My wife," he added, his voice low and rough. It was the first time he had mentioned her. Anna finished with the sugar and placed the dispenser back on the table with a soft click. She looked at the fresh pot of coffee she had just brewed. "It's a good day for coffee then," she said gently. It was an acknowledgement, not a question. A quiet offering of shared space in a sad moment. He looked at her then, a real look, his eyes clearing for a second. He saw her. Not just the waitress, the girl who brought him coffee. He saw the person who had just built a small, safe bridge over a chasm of his grief, and had done so without asking for anything in return. From the other side of the booth, Matteo spoke, his voice small and clear. "My mama liked pancakes." He looked from his father to Anna, a small, sad statement of fact. It landed with the force of a shout. Marco's shoulders, which were always so straight, so braced, seemed to drop by a fraction of an inch. He reached out and placed his hand on his son's head, his fingers sinking into the boy's dark hair. It was the softest gesture Anna had ever seen him make. She turned away, giving them the privacy of the moment, and went to pour Marco another cup of coffee he hadn't asked for. The first sign of a different kind of trouble came in the form of a man named Henderson. He was the opposite of Marco in every way. Where Marco was solid, silent power, Henderson was a flimsy suit filled with cheap cologne and loud talk. He was a representative for a property developer that had been buying up the whole block. The greasy spoon was the last holdout. Henderson started coming in every few days, sitting at the counter and talking to Mel in a voice that was both confidential and loud enough for everyone to hear. He used words like progress and revitalization, but they sounded like threats. One Thursday afternoon, Henderson was there when Marco and Matteo arrived. He was leaning over the counter, his back to the door, trying to get Mel to look at a set of blueprints. "Think about it, Mel," he was saying, his voice slick with false camaraderie. "A generous offer. You could retire. Go to Florida. This place is a relic." Anna saw Marco pause in the doorway, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the scene. He led Matteo to their usual booth, his movements even more deliberate than usual. Henderson didn't notice them. He was too absorbed in his own performance. "And you," he said, turning and finally seeing Anna. He gave her a dismissive once-over. "You could probably get a job at the new Starbucks they're putting in. Better tips." The insult was casual, designed to put her in her place. A place far beneath him. Anna felt a hot flush of anger. Before she could respond, Mel stammered. "She's a good worker, Mr. Henderson." "I'm sure she is," Henderson said with a smirk, turning back to his blueprints. Anna took a deep breath. She picked up a coffee pot. She walked over to Marco's table, ignoring Henderson completely. "Coffee?" she asked Marco, her voice steady. Marco's eyes weren't on her. They were on Henderson. There was a cold, flat stillness in his gaze that made the hairs on Anna's arms stand up. It was the look of a predator watching an oblivious, noisy animal. Matteo was watching his father. He had put his crayon down. "Yes," Marco said, his voice quiet, pulling his gaze back to Anna. "Thank you," Henderson, finally sensing a shift in the room's atmosphere, turned around. He saw Marco, a man in a perfectly tailored coat, being served by the waitress he'd just insulted. He saw the quality of the coat, the stillness of the man, and his salesman's smile faltered. He cleared his throat. "Well, Mel." "Think it over." He gathered his papers, gave Marco a nervous, questioning look that went unreturned, and hurried out. The bell chimed his hasty retreat. The diner was silent. Marco took a slow sip of his coffee. He didn't say a word about what had just happened. He didn't have to. The next day, Anna came in for her shift to find Mel staring out the front window, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. He was holding a piece of paper. "He's gone," Mel said, his voice a bewildered whisper. "Who's gone?" Anna asked, tying on her apron. "Henderson. The developers. They withdrew the offer." He handed her the paper. It was a sterile, corporate letter. "Due to a sudden and unforeseen restructuring of our investment priorities in the district," it read. There was no other explanation. Mel was ecstatic, confused, and relieved all at once. He kept muttering about divine intervention. Anna was quiet. She knew it wasn't divine. It was Marco. She didn't know how he'd done it, what calls he'd made, what pressure he'd applied.
She didn't want to know.
The knowledge sat in her stomach like a smooth, heavy stone. It was a relief, but it was also a weight. A debt she hadn't asked for and could never repay. When Marco and Matteo came in that afternoon, the air was different. The unspoken thing was a third person at their table. Anna poured his coffee, her movements precise. She felt his eyes on her, watching. He knew that she knew. "Everything is okay here?" he asked. It was a simple question. His gaze was steady. He was offering her the chance to pretend. "Yes," she said, meeting his eyes. "Everything's fine." The words were a pact. An acceptance. She was in his debt, and they would both agree never to speak of it. But the diner no longer felt entirely hers. Before, it had been her sanctuary, a place separate from the world. Now, his world had bled into it, staining it with a dark, unseen color. She was safe from men like Henderson, but she felt a new, more profound kind of danger. The protection he offered was not gentle. It was absolute. It was the protection of a locked cage. Later, as she was wiping down the counter, Matteo, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, walked up to her. He held out his small hand. In his palm was a single, perfect pancake, saved from his plate. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her with his old, serious eyes and offered her the food. A small, perfect circle of their strange, complicated relationship. A payment for a debt of his own. Anna took it. Her fingers brushed his, and for a moment, he let his hand rest in hers. A week later, Anna was closing up. Mel had left early, and the last customer had shuffled out an hour ago. The rain was back, a soft, persistent drizzle that blurred the streetlights into halos. She had just finished mopping the floor when she saw the headlights of the black sedan cut through the gloom. It parked across the street, engine idling. It just sat there for 10 minutes. Anna's heart started a low, steady drumbeat against her ribs. She wasn't afraid, not exactly. She was waiting. The driver's door opened, and Marco got out. He didn't have an umbrella. He just stood in the fine mist for a moment, looking at the diner, then walked across the street. Anna unlocked the door before he could knock. He stepped inside, bringing the smell of rain and cold night air with him. He was alone. His hair was damp, glistening under the dim lights of the diner. He looked tired, more tired than she had ever seen him. "You should be home," he said. It wasn't an accusation. "I was just finishing up," she replied, her voice sounding small in the empty room. He walked past her and slid into their booth. He didn't sit with his back to the wall this time. He sat on the outside, facing the empty seat opposite him. An invitation. After a moment's hesitation, Anna walked over and slid into the seat where his mother always sat. They sat in silence, the only sounds the hum of the cooler and the rain against the glass. "The men who wanted to buy this place," he began, his voice low. "They will not bother you again. I know," she said. "Thank you." He shook his head, a short, sharp gesture of dismissal. "It is not a gift. It is a complication." He looked at his hands, which were resting on the table. They were strong, capable hands. She wondered what they had done. "My world," he said, his voice rough with something she couldn't name. "It is not like this. It is not warm. Kindness is a liability. It is a weakness that other men will use. When you were kind to my mother, you put a mark on this place. On yourself." The confession was not in what he said, but in what he didn't. He wasn't a businessman. He was something else. Something that dealt in liabilities and weaknesses. The shape of it, which had been a shadow in the corner of her mind, now solidified. "I knew she was hungry," Anna said simply. It was the only explanation that mattered. He looked up at her then, and his eyes were full of a terrible, ancient sadness. "I know you did. That is the problem." He leaned forward slightly. "I cannot protect you from the consequences of my world without pulling you into it. And I cannot leave you unprotected. Do you understand?" Anna held his gaze. Her instincts had been right all along. She had felt the danger from the first moment he'd walked in. But she had also felt the grief. The humanity. She thought of Matteo's drawing, of the small pancake he had offered her. "He's a good boy, Matteo," she said, her voice soft. The statement seemed to knock the air out of him. It was a reminder of the one thing in his world that was not a liability but a reason. He leaned back, the tension leaving his shoulders. "Yes," he whispered. "He is." He stayed for a long time after that, just sitting in the quiet of her diner. He didn't talk about his world again. Instead, he asked her about hers. He asked about the town, about her family, about the faded photograph of her grandmother she kept tucked by the register. She found herself telling him things she rarely spoke of growing up in a house that was always full of people, of learning to cook at her grandmother's elbow, of the dream she had of one day having a small place of her own, somewhere with a garden. He listened. He didn't offer solutions or money. He just listened, his dark eyes watching her, his presence a heavy, comforting weight in the booth. When she finally ran out of words, the silence that fell was different. It was comfortable.
Known.
The rain had softened to a barely audible whisper against the windows. He finally looked at the clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight. "I should let you go home," he said, his voice still low, but with the rough edges smoothed away. He stood, and Anna slid out of the booth. They stood by the door, the space between them charged with everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. This was a threshold, a point of no return. He could walk out that door, and she might never see him again. The thought left a surprising ache in her chest. Anna, he said, and it was the first time he had used her name. It sounded solid, real. He reached out, not to touch her, but he placed a second key on the counter beside her own. It was a heavy, old-fashioned brass key. Mel is a good man, but he is old. This place, it is yours now. The paperwork will be done tomorrow. Anna stared at the key. It wasn't money. It wasn't a threat. It was a future. The one she had just told him she dreamed of. I can't, she whispered, overwhelmed. You can, he said, his voice firm but gentle. You will. He opened the door, and the cool night air rushed in. He paused on the threshold, his silhouette framed against the wet, glistening street. He didn't look back. I will see you tomorrow, Anna, he said. And then he was gone, his footsteps fading into the night. Anna stood there for a long time, looking at the key on her counter. It was a promise and a warning, a cage and a kingdom. She picked it up. It was warm from his hand. She walked to the window and watched as the black sedan's taillights disappeared into the darkness. The rain had stopped. Through a break in the clouds, a single star was visible. The next afternoon, he came back. He was with Elena and Matteo. They sat in their booth. Her booth. Anna brewed a fresh pot of coffee. She ladled out a bowl of tomato soup. She made a small plate of pancakes. She carried it all over on a tray and set it down. She didn't feel like a waitress. She felt like a woman setting the table for her family. As she put the plate in front of Matteo, he looked up and gave her a small, shy smile. And then he did something he had never done before. He leaned over, just for a second, and rested his head against her arm. It was a small, fleeting gesture, but it was everything.